It'll just be buffering. Okay. I wonder if I should just take it off the.
So I'm going to do an introduction in a moment. And if you just hold that seat for me, okay. And thank you. I'll do a little introduction, and then we'll have Ken and Brad here. But before I do my introduction, I'd like to introduce wBrad, or 20 Summers. I'll do a little bit about this wonderful organization.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Good evening. How about this weather this afternoon? Beautiful outside. I'm glad you're all here. Who in this room has never heard of 20 Summers? Okay, a couple of you. Good. I see lots of friendly faces, but it's good to see you all here. 20 Summers is an incubator for art and ideas. We provide artist residencies, resources, and a platform for artists to create and exhibit and show their work and connect with audiences right here in P-Town. We do our season every May and June over here on Miller Hill Road in the Hawthorne Barn, which was the location of the original location of the Cape Cod School of Art. It was built in 1907. It's a beautiful historic barn that one of your speakers tonight helped to redesign and make beautiful again. And so we just finished up our 11th season of programming, and it was our most ambitious ever. It was a really successful season. If I go back to the history of 20 Summers, we started out as mainly a literary organization where we were featuring authors and in conversation with other luminaries. So tonight it's really a special honor to be partnered with Jeff and East End Books to have the speakers that we have here tonight. And I will leave it to him to introduce them, of course. So for those of you who don't know us and have not been to our events before, please go to 20summers.org and sign up for our email list so you'll know what events we have coming up. And also, if you wish, you can make a contribution there. So we do our core season in the Hawthorne Barn, right over here on Miller Hill Road. But this year we actually added a secondary location, which is just underneath of us in this building. So we now will be offering programming outside of May and June. So it's important that you sign up for that email list so you know what we've got going on. So I hope to see some of you at our events coming up this year, both here at 494 Commercial, as well as next year in May and June over on Miller Hill Road at the Hawthorne Barn. So I'll now leave it to Jeff to introduce our two interlocutors tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. There might be a few tickets left to the wonderful dinner that will be after this downstairs in the gallery that's benefiting 20 Summers. So if you are interested, you can see Bill afterwards, because I think we always have a little bit of with catering to account for people coming at the last minute. And it's going to be a beautiful event with 4 artists in town, one of which is David Chick. We got some eye in here, and they're going to be doing instant art in the style of Keith Haring and contemporary. So there's other surprises going on down there as well. So, okay, so very quickly, East End Books P-Town. This summer, we are all over the town while the beautiful public park is being constructed behind the store. So this is our first event at the Davis Event Space at WMR, and we're very thankful to WMR for allowing us to be here. Tomorrow night, we have Gerard Conley with his beautiful new book, All the World Beside, in conversation with Ann Hutchinson. And you may know Gerard from his book, Boy Erased, which was made into a movie with Nicole Kidman. So if you're around tomorrow, the book is fantastic. It's set in Massachusetts, and it's already, I think it's A20, he'll tell us, I think it's A24 is making the movie of it. And so there's a lot of events coming up. You can see them all on our website. The ones that are remaining that are getting pretty full, is the next one that's like almost sold out is August 23rd at the Fine Arts Work Center. Michael Cunningham in conversation with I don't know why it's going here. Ben Shattuck. But Ben's beautiful new story collection and a certain actress we love in the audience. Her new book will be out in the fall with Jenny Slate and East End Books. We'll be having an event with Jenny Slate, Ben Shattuck, and Julia Glass at our new store in the Seaport in Boston, which is open now, right into the ICA Museum on Pier 4, around over there. And then I just wanted to mention a couple other things. Another one getting full, August 2nd, we have Dawn Tripp with her beautiful new historical novel, Jackie. That book already went into its second printing, like a couple weeks after it came out, so that was really amazing. And then we also have, right before that, 8/1, we have Adrienne Bordeaux with her great new book, Little Monsters, which is being made into a limited series. Adrienne is also with the Aspen Institute, and runs their arts and literary program. She's a wonderful person. She'll be in conversation with a local here in Georgia, Cynthia Newbury-Martin, the author, so we hope you can attend that. And then there's information soon going on from Provincetown Art Society website, phenomenal event August 8th with Doris Kearns Goodwin and Ken and Kevin Sessoms, and that's a fundraiser for Provincetown Art Society. There's a flyer over here with information about it, and it'll be on their site shortly, so hopefully you go to that. And then everything else is on our website. If you take a look at it, it's quite a lineup of events all summer. The only caution is just look at the event page to see where it is, because it could be here in the library, Fine Arts Work Center, you name it. And I wanted to say very quickly that how grateful I am that you're all here. And I also wanted to say that I'm thrilled, of course, along with our conversants tonight, to see that one of my favorite people is here, Alan Poole, who his latest project is one of my favorites, Tokyo Vice, which I think is an outstanding series. If you haven't seen it, you should see that series. So now, we're thrilled to present to you Ken Fulk, designer of experiences large and small, renowned for his layered interiors, his high-concept hospitality brands, and his unforgettable parties. Among the many things he's done is he, of course, recreated and restored the American Divorce House and created the Provincetown Art Society, and has done so much for so many nonprofits, many of whom are in this room. And he not only there, but at St. Joseph's Art Society in San Francisco and elsewhere. This man does so much for charities across the country. It's just amazing, and we're really thrilled to have him here tonight to be in conversation with Brad Gooch, poet, novelist, and biographer, whose previous 10 books include Flannery, Life of Flannery O'Connor, and many other books, including one of my favorites, with the exception the new one's my favorite, but The City Poet, The Life and Times of Frank O'Hara, who I just love that book. Smash Cut is his brilliant book as well. There's so many books in there, and I think tonight in the audience is one of his sons who was here years ago when we had Brad for an event at live stream event at the bookstore, and he, in the middle of the event, adorably came into the store to kiss Brad and say, "I love you, Daddy," and everybody on the live stream and in person was just over the moon. So thank you here tonight. So Radiant, the life and line of Keith Haring. We got a lot of information here tonight about it. It's a brilliant, brilliant book about Keith Haring, and I'll say that not only is the print book phenomenal, and of course as a bookseller I prefer you buy that, but we also sell on our website the audio book, which I have to say is equally awesome. So if you want to get that, that's an option. And if you buy it on our website, it's the same audio book you can get from a certain company who I won't name, and instead of giving them the money, you're supporting independent bookstores. And so most independent bookstores that have a website from the American Booksellers Association, you can buy audio and ebooks from them, and it supports them instead of the others. So anyway, you're going to hear a lot about the event tonight and about the book, and we're really thrilled, like I said, to have Brad Gooch and Ken Fulk here tonight.
We were already talking.
I know, we've already finished.
Thank you for coming to Providence.
No, well, you seem very comfortable here.
I am Providence.
Be loved and
I I love this place, so I am a fortunate fellow to get to call it home for more days of the year than not. So that's my great privilege, and we are grateful that you're here, and grateful for this big, fat, wonderful book that I did manage to delightfully read. I was sharing Alex, my friend, I was like, I have to read this book, I have to finish it. No, it was like finding the time, and instead it was joy and wonderful and exciting. I think it was a time that maybe I could have had a different life and run away from New York. When I was a little kid, I used to come out and at dinner parties tell everyone that I was going to live in Manhattan when I grew up and live in a penthouse. And I didn't do those things, but you kind of did.
No penthouse.
No penthouse. And I do think about when I was reading it with Keith Haring, who came from a small town in Pennsylvania, you from a small town in Pennsylvania, and me from a small town in Virginia, but just that thing of where we grew up, reading about Keith and the experiences of his childhood, his connection to his family, the way religion played a big role in his life. Sort of interestingly, his father, who was a Marine, yet encouraged his son. It's found that so sort of I don't know, pieces of my own little weird story in there of growing up in a town where I felt an alien, yet somehow, and you lived in New York when he was in New York and this was all happening, and could see his art. And did you see a lot of your own experiences in telling this story? You've obviously told your own sort of piece of a biography in your previous book, but how did you do that, and how did you tell his story and with your own view and your own life experiences?
No, it was helpful having, coming from Pennsylvania, and then I was living in the East Village in 1978 when Keith arrives in New York, and would come across his art and come across him. So it was a different experience as a biographer to think that, so there are all these characters like Rene Ricard, secondary characters in the book who I also knew, and so I could tell, if that was really Rene and if the adjective was the right adjective. And there are all these clubs, which you can't necessarily assume that everyone knows now when you say area or Club 57, what they're talking about. So that all made it easier as a biographer. But Keith comes from Kutztown, a little town in the middle of Pennsylvania, seems unpromising. He has this ex-Marine father, though the ex-Marine father is also an amateur cartoonist who is teaching Keith from age 4, encouraging him to draw, exposing him to Andy Warhol, and not to Andy Warhol, to Walt Disney and Dr. Seuss and these figures. Later, Keith says the 3 greatest 20th century artists are Picasso, Warhol, and Walt Disney. So there's obviously this influence, and it seems like an unpromising, kind of conservative, small town for a major artist to come from. But then a lot of these Pennsylvania towns were equally unpromising and productive, apparently. Warhol was from Pittsburgh. Franz Klein came from Wilkes-Barre, where I'm from. Calder was from a little town outside of Harrisburg. Jeff Koons is from York County in the north. So it's a funny story of the Pennsylvania boy who wants to come to New York. So, at that point, I do remember you had to want to go somewhere if you wanted to meet people, to be an artist. There was always an idea of some earlier generation, I think, that you were kind of recreating. So Keith and friends, like Kenny Sharp, came to New York partly to be Andy Warhol, partly to have their own factory. Who was me, and I was a poet. At that time, you were coming to New York to be Frank O'Hara, or Kenneth Koch, or John Ashbery. So there was this kind of model that required. And Keith was also, like me, coming to New York to come out. After Kutztown, he goes for a couple of years to Pittsburgh, first to a kind of commercial art school, partly to satisfy his parents who don't see art as a viable career path, especially then. But also he has a girlfriend for 2 years in Pittsburgh, Susie, who I talked to a lot. I mean, she'd never spoken to anyone, and we had kind of formal interview, which was okay. And then I discovered that she liked to DM on Facebook. And then over like 2 years, we had this ping pong game going back and forth about Keith and Pittsburgh at the time. And so I found out a lot, but part of his thing there is he kind of puts together his idea of what an artist is. A lot of it depended on what was showing at the Carnegie Museum at the time. And also towards the end, then he starts coming out and going especially to black dance bars and cruising areas in Pittsburgh. And so for both these goals, then he arrives in New York. Certainly for the coming out, it was a prime time to arrive. I'm within 24 hours of being left by his dad at the 23rd Street YMCA. Where you could stay if you were an SBA student. And it was the season when they filmed the YMCA video with those guys. He finds his way to Christopher Street, which he said was like landing in a gay Disneyland. So he was there at the right time for that, and he was also then going to School of Visual Arts, which at that moment, if you look at Keith's course list, very much the mood of that time. He wasn't really painting. He was taking video, conceptual art with Joseph Kazuth, performance art with Simone Forti, and so all that milieu kind of informs him, and then at a certain point he puts himself in the corner, which he often would do, of deciding to have a painting show at Club 57. Club 57 was the local clubhouse mainly of SBA students. I always thought it was kind of silly. It wasn't really where I was hanging out, which was more gay bars of the West Village. But they really saw themselves as the factory, or as like Club Voltaire of the Dadaists. So he and his friend Frank Holliday decided they're going to have a painting show. Keith doesn't have any paintings, he hasn't done them, so he borrows a friend's studio and in 4 days creates this work, and it's all new work. And out of him, he's been doing kind of abstractions, which you see in his work. I'm looking where a lot of people wear hair and things, so that's design. He's doing that design. But then out of him basically kind of flow these images by which we know him still. I mean, the crawling baby, the barking dog, this UFO flying saucer he got from a 50s sci-fi movie. He saw a monster movie night at Club 57, the ziggurats in black and white, figures and different kind of erotic power relationships to each other. All that happens. And Frank Holliday told me that Keith invited him over to look at the work, since they're having a show together. The studio he borrowed was in Chelsea, and Frank looked up, you could see in this industrial building, 4th floor, this kind of red dog in day glow paint, and he said, "Oh shit, you stole the show from me." Which turned out to be true. I mean, it was kind of Keith's night. And from there, then, he builds in a way that he's very alert to from his semiotics class at SBA. I mean, it was interesting in writing this book, what an earnest, hard-working artist Keith Haring was.
He produced so much work.
Produced so much work.
Like I read, I don't know if it's here, but I was reading that like, there's not a true catalog, because there's work that was never truly cataloged, but like maybe 10,000 works in 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, well, 5,000 of these where he starts drawing on the subways, and then his friend Sang Kwang Chi luckily photographed a lot of these, and that's really about the only record we have of them, except for people who went around and cut them out. Which Keith hated, was part of why he wound up not doing this project. But he did for 5 years, and he created 5,000 of these chalk drawings in the subway on these black matte surfaces where you would put advertising posters. So between one Smirnoff poster and an O Calcutta poster, Keith would do one of these drawings. And from this, of course, he gains this huge audience. And no one knew who was doing these at first.
And do you like specifically remember yourself seeing them?
Yeah, I mean, I do. What I really specifically remember, the first Keith Haring piece I saw, I was walking with my lover, Howard Brookner, who's a filmmaker, across town from the West Village where I've been living to.
By the
East
way, if you
Village.
haven't read the other book, that's a great.
Smash cut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
And also someone brought up today that his nephew Aaron Brookner made a movie, Uncle Howard, about Howard also. So wonderful Howard and I were walking down the street, and they're stamped in graphite on each corner was "Clones Go Home" by this kind of fake organization, Bags Against Facial Hair, which Keith had started. Inside joke in the gay community about the West Village where everyone was
All had beards, right?
All had beards, and East Village everyone was cool and having art. And Howard said to me, "You should go home." Do you remember that? So I saw that. I would see. Then Keith started doing these drawings in Soho, and there was a newsstand where I saw kind of the crawling baby, barking dog, and then the subways. And when you're doing the subway drawings, first mainly downtown, then potentially millions of people could see these.
And when he was doing these, was it, because part of it is sort of, you think of like JR, the artist now, who, is still like, part of it is hiding his identity a bit because he doesn't want to be arrested. And I read that Keith was arrested when he did Crack is Whack. When he first did it, and then they ended up releasing him on lesser charges, but got arrested for that. And was this seen as subversive? Was it accepted as a whole, or was it seen like someone's defacing something? Because it's like, graffiti is in some ways divisive.
Sure. I mean, graffiti was very controversial at the time. And so when Keith arrives in 1978, it's sort of a high moment for wild style in graffiti, which are spray painted on subway cars with this kind of bubble lettering, this kind of acid TV color, de Kooning scale. And Keith would go down into the subway stations not to get a train, but to sit in the bench and watch these cars go by. I mean, it was a gallery show for him. So he, that's what he was emulating. He's also an art student kid. So he wasn't trying necessarily to be that. He only once went to the subway yards with LA2, an artist he was working with, and he was just so nervous the whole time. And he just thought, if the police come, they're definitely going to pick on me. I mean, the older, like, tall white guy with his kids. So he went, and he didn't use spray paint. So what he did was this, next to the subway, on these spaces that had been overlooked by everyone, was doing his kind of chalk thing. So he found a way to be both himself and to respond to the graffiti artists of the time. But built into it was, graffiti art was definitely illegal. There were big campaigns through Mayor Koch that spent lots of money like erasing all of this work on the subways, and they would arrest people, and he was such a weird arrest.
Yeah.
but it happened numerous times. By the time he does the crack is
He was
uptown,
famous.
he was famous, and so he does this because one of his studio assistants gets addicted to crack, which is an instant kind of addiction. And there's a neighborhood uptown where this was epidemic. So he does this, he's very much an activist and does this big crack is whack mural. And then he's on the way out, he didn't get paperwork or any kind of permissions that they would have given them to him, and he's arrested, right? Then there's a trial date, and he could potentially be sent to Rikers Island. There's going to be you have to pay a fee at least. And this gets picked up. He's getting interviewed by the Post or something at some point, and he tells them, "Oh, tomorrow I have to, or next week I have to be in court." This is, of course, they publish this. It gets picked up by everybody, and it's also the trial is like the night after the Reagans have their Just Say No television thing. So he, like, it dovetails with that moment, and he becomes a kind of cause célèbre.
And it's still there.
Yeah, it's been redone, and then it's there. I was just there to be filmed for French TV. That's how the time, how it switched over, because he is then not sent to Rikers Island, and then the Parks Commission asks him back to repaint because they covered it over in silver paint. So and Keith could never do the same thing twice. He didn't work from sketches. He was very much like a kind of beat writer. Everything was automatic, and he didn't censor himself. And so he just did a whole new thing. Except then the Parks Commissioner was there holding an umbrella because it was raining. This is weird. And there's a picture in the New York Times of that moment. But that's what happened in that case.
And you talked about where he stopped, because so much of what he did, he obviously became famous in his lifetime, and which isn't always the case, and became very famous, and his art became valuable, at least probably beyond his imagination, and he hated when people would take the subway drawings because they were commercializing it and profiting from it and kind of taking his art is for everyone
Right.
kind of stance.
Well, now we're sort of thankful for those in a way.
Sure,
The only
because
examples
they do
you have
exist,
is
yeah.
illicitly ripped off pieces.
But it also was perhaps because he opened the pop shop, which was a way to provide access that, because his paintings had become expensive by that point, by at least those standards of the time, and yet you would have access to, a piece of his work, or, and it made it sort of egalitarian, yet it's also heavily commercialized and frankly very of today, and it lived on until the 2000s, right?
I mean, there's a kind of two-step process there. The first was by doing these subway drawings and all the talk being around who's doing these drawings. There was a piece in the Daily News that called him Chalk Man. So by doing this, he creates his own audience, basically. He doesn't have to go around with his slides to gallery dealers to try to get a show. And he does then have his first one-person show at Tony Shafrazi Gallery, and he's 24 years old. The show is unlike other shows that it's on the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Because when he came to New York, Diego Cortez, who was a court curator at the time, did a New York New Wave show, told me that when he and Keith came to New York in the 70s, the art world was like white people in white rooms drinking white wine. So this show, then you have hundreds of these graffiti artists showing up, but you also have Roy Lichtenstein and Rauschenberg, Francesco Clementi. You have kids, because Keith, that's an important audience for Keith Haring, and he does coloring books. So you have kids beside his lover at the time. Black DJ named Juan DuBose is spinning records. He's collaborating with LA2, Angel Ortiz, and they do in black light in the basement, their collaborative sculpture and painting. And you have wind up with thousands of people out onto the streets of Soho. So he has a fresh sort of art. He didn't want to draw on canvas because it was too old-fashioned, so he was painting on tarp, which is what plastic Con Ed was using to cover their construction sites. So he's kind of reinventing a lot in that way. And Charles Osgood is the narrator of that program, and then at the end says how the show sold out for $250,000. Not bad for a 24-year-old kid from Kutztown, Pennsylvania. He has that kind of launch and becomes an international art star.
But yet
quickly
not accepted really by, which there was sort of an attitude around it, right? I mean, I read that MoMA still only owns one, or it's gifted to it. One that the huge, when they reopened, huge, like 40-foot long piece, but
No, he's never had a gallery show in America while he was alive. Museum show, yeah. Sorry. He was showing at the Bordeaux in France, and at the Pompidou, and at the Stedelijk, and with these important dealers in France. But in America, he had a rough time. Part of it was you mentioned the pop shop. I mean, no other artist at that time opened a store. Keith was very close with Andy Warhol. Warhol was a big influence because of his confluence with popular culture, using popular culture in his work. But even Warhol was worried that people wouldn't take Haring seriously as a fine artist because he was opening the store. And it was really, the store was never designed to make money. Actually, Leo Castelli, who showed Haring's sculpture, said that the pop shop itself is a work of art. It was in this all immersively painted by Haring. The ceiling now hangs over the New York Historical Society in the lobby. And he was showing, but he was selling t-shirts that he thought of as prints and pins, and just also these images that you then would, a couple blocks away, pay $10,000 for, then he was available at these other price points. But people then, he was accused of being a capitalist and a sellout.
It's sort of almost also an elitist thing a little bit.
Oh, completely in the art world at the time. And the big critic articulating all this was Robert Hughes, who was at Time magazine. He had targeted Haring and Basquiat early on, and he would write about them as Keith Boring and John Michel Basket Case. He said that Haring was a disco decorator. So there was a kind of shade of at least homophobia at that time in this resistance, I think, to Haring, or racism with Basquiat, as Haring pointed out when Hughes called Basquiat the Eddie Murphy of art. All this was going on, so there was this real, it triggered sort of pushback that he was experiencing. And the art world at that time, I go at the end of the book, the epilogue, and talk to Ann Temkin, who's the head curator of painting and sculpture at MoMA now. And she sort of apologized to me for the institution. I mean, why did they not, they bought no work of Haring's, they never showed Haring. Likewise with Basquiat. And she was just explaining the art world at the time had these ideas which have sort of been pulverized over the decades, but this distinction between fine art, high art, and any kind of public art, political art, comic art, street art. And Haring was all of that and he had his kind of humor in his work. The idea was more that a lot of times art was this secret club in a way. You had to understand what everyone was commenting on. He didn't really fit into that. He wanted accessibility and he wanted communication. But she said, that I thought was most interesting, that there's often this sort of 30-year lag in understanding, especially radical.
But it's so weird to me, just because, you know, one, you have Warhol, who was incredibly commercial and, you know, had appeared on Love Boat, you know, like, so it wasn't as if, and, you know, you had someone who was incredibly, like, I remember as a kid seeing, you know, the sets he made for MTV. I so remember there's a famous Annie Leibovitz photograph where he paints his own body, because he had painted Bill T. Jones and Grace Jones, and which I'd love to know more about the painting of the bodies. But Annie Leibovitz had wanted to photograph him, and they had created a cardboard set of furniture. It was kind of intrigued me. And it was all painted white, and he had painted himself and came out in like painter's pants, and he painted in 40 minutes all of the furniture, and so it all has, almost looks like a print, like up at a zebra-like effect to it, and then they're like both realized that he needed to go ahead and finish the job and paint the rest of himself, and he does the line on his penis. And for me, being a kid, it was like seeing, he was very cute guy, had a nice looking penis in the photograph. So it was such an, just like, you know, you wanted to look at it for so many reasons. It was visually beautiful and stimulating, but so anyway, the fact that he was just.
They also, at Keith's instigation, then went outside and
he went to Times Square,
and he had Annie taking pictures.
He got in a cab or whatever and went to Times Square.
So he was a performer.
Yeah.
You know, that was an important part of it.
And took his picture there. But anyway, just somebody that was so culturally relevant. And then I want to talk about the political part. But it's just interesting that, you know, here pop art was certainly a thing. Yet it really was sort of, it's almost like music where we won't recognize certain genres of music because they're outside of what is deemed, you know, appropriate or acceptable or true music until maybe it is the 30-year rule.
But it's interesting, the Warhol-Haring conversation. I mean, in what ways they're similar, in what ways they're not. You're the expert,
but I look at it and think, like, because Warhol really, the commentary, and like Warhol was taking something that looked pop, but very like, you know, painting Marissa Berenson and being where the Haring, it was all about accessibility and messaging and statements of, and from such a good, to me at least, good place, a place of, that was his way of communicating. It was also like social media, by the way. I wanted to talk about that. It was his form of it in so many ways.
But one is that I think Warhol was ironic about, he was a different generation. So pop art, TV, all this stuff, he was kind of ironic about it. And whereas Keith was very earnest and excited. I mean, he didn't have that, never had that kind of quotation marks distance from anything. And I taught, one thing I taught, because Keith was very close to kids, and in talking to these kids who were really his friends, you would get like their point of view from that time, but now, as an adult. One of them was Sean Lennon, who was close to both Warhol and Haring because of Yoko Ono, his mother. And he would just say that they just, and Warhol complained in his diary, oh, Sean likes Keith better than he likes me. He said, but what it was that you know, Andy said was kind of like chic. I mean, he would wear these jackets and Mr. Chow and things, and Sean didn't know what chic was that he, but Keith was wearing what the kids were wearing in middle school. Sneakers and t-shirts and things like that. And he said also the work, he didn't understand what Warhol's work was really about. It wasn't made for him. And you know, Keith's use of comic art and graphic art and these kind of colors were very immediate. So that's part of the kind of difference in a way. And also, you know, Warhol like took kind of these pop subjects and then treated them very seriously. And I think Haring took often really serious topics. You're talking about activism, about environmentalism, about apartheid, about racism, about gay liberation, about AIDS eventually. But he presents them in these cartoon kind of colors. So it's kind of bright looking message. So there's some, so that's the,
Yeah,
it's
there's
like the opposite.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's obviously like, I don't know that anger is the right word, but like a little rage in the idea that, and yet they're accessible because they're happy looking,
Right.
and you want to look at it, yet the messaging is, but just, you know, I'm curious though, do you think that bubbled up from coming, where did that come from? Because it isn't just, you know, it was a cross, it was apartheid, it was AIDS, it was so, you know, it was the idea, the crack is whack message
Right.
of really holding a mirror up and having social commentary around it from a really young man. And I think all of us tend to be more idealistic when we're young, but that's a lot to focus on top of being famous and hanging out with Madonna and making, I didn't know this until I read this, but he did, Vivienne Westwood met with him and he made, like Madonna wears a skirt by Keith Haring in one of her Borderline videos. And you know, there's just so much to unpack there around what drove a young man to.
It was pretty intact when we're talking about Kutztown. I mean, he was a Jesus freak for a while, and then going around and pasting up all over Kutztown these one-way stickers. And he's a deadhead, so he follows around the Grateful Dead and is selling, you know,
Like the monkeys
t-shirts.
the Beatles.
Right. Yeah, all that was completely there from the beginning. He was also going, I mean, he went to the first Earth Day. It was on Kutztown University campus when he was 12 years old. So he had, all this was weirdly intact. And the tone, it was interesting. I would read the journals. I was in the foundation, which is in Haring's old studio on Lower Broadway a lot. And I went through everything. If you want to see Haring's Con Ed bills from '78, you can see them because he kept everything.
Did he pay his bills?
What?
He kept the lights on.
But in these early journals, and the journals in Pittsburgh, when he's hitchhiking across the country with Susie and following the Grateful Dead, there's this kind of really moving, earnest, romantic ambition about how he wants to be an artist. And he wants to be an artist that connects all the other arts and to dance and to theater, and just this idea that he could change the world in some way. And then I was thinking, oh, it's so sweet, like seeing a teenage artist, portrait of the artist as a young man, that kind of voice coming through. And then I realized when you get to the end, and there's John Gruen did this kind of 22-hour interview with Keith before he died, and also reading those journals, and I realized it's the same voice. And you kind of accept it. The ambition now makes sense. It sounded naive before, but he never somehow changes out of that. There's always something naive, and there's always some big plan. And near the end, he's talking about, which I read about in the prologue, and he's in Japan, and that there's a project where they're going to film you know, from space, from the sky, these Japanese students, kids in elementary school are gonna hold up mirrors at sunrise, and it's gonna be a crawling baby, right? And then he's thinking, but you could do that around the world, and you could have it, you know, the satellite would follow it, and you would have it in Paris and in Berlin, and my baby would crawl around the world. And then he says, anything's possible. Or is it? Or is it?
I didn't know he was inspired or met with Christo, and that was part of his, which I had no idea, and I thought, how interesting, and it kind of makes sense, and boy, oh boy, it makes you wish that he, and for lots of reasons, but lived longer for some of those bigger, wonderful things that happen.
Well, those big projects, I mean, Walt Disney, he always wanted to do, I mean, he wrote in his journal, oh, I wish I could design a sneaker, and big, you know, ambition was to work with Walt Disney. Then he's dying of AIDS, and these last weeks, he gets, a letter comes into the studio from Walt Disney suggesting this collaboration, Mickey Mouse collaboration with Haring, and his assistant, Julia Gruen, reads it to him, and at this point he's kind of in and out of consciousness, but he definitely snaps to it, and then he accuses her of having made it up so he would feel better or live longer or something. But it was actually, so those are the kinds of things that he was heading towards.
And I was moved to read, because so much of this I didn't know, but you know, he admitted or came out to talk about his HIV and AIDS diagnosis in Rolling Stone, which was a thing where, you know, Rock Hudson is now dead and still claiming that, you know, he didn't die. No one was sort of willing to step out and be the face of this as someone sort of famous and someone who really owned it in his work, but owned it publicly with his own life and his death. And
No, it was interesting for me to, I mean, there are many people died of AIDS, but everyone, of course, died a little differently. So one thing, both medically and spiritually, I mean, how it was interesting for me to trace how Keith Haring faced this in his life. And he, I mean, he's in Tokyo and he sees that he has these spots which are Kaposi sarcoma. This is about 1988, but very soon then does come out as a PWA, person with AIDS, and that, you know, this really emboldens people because no one's doing this. He also turns his work over to this kind of AIDS activism. Question on Jeopardy the other night that no one got was about who painted the Silence Equals Death paintings, which is Keith Haring.
Nobody got it.
No one here was watching Jeopardy. So he turns his work over, I mean, he's doing posters and things, and he's also part of ACT UP, doing events, and also Peter Staley, who was the treasurer of ACT UP, told me that he would go to Keith's studio, and Keith would give him these brown paper bags. They would have like $10,000 in cash. Peter would go to the city bank on LaGuardia Place and put it in the ACT UP account. And so Peter said like a third of the receipts of ACT UP in 1989 were covered by Keith Haring, and no one knew that. I mean, that was just under the radar. So in all these ways, he was being active, as he'd been during the two Ronald Reagan elections of 1980 and 1984 very much. So he was willing to take on daunting challenges always in that way as an activist. He also didn't melt away in terms of his work. I mean, he instead kind of revved everything up. And he did more and more and more work. He traveled to more and more and more places. He did this big mural on the outside of a church in Pisa Mundo, like 6 months before he died. His last major work that he did at Yoko Ono's apartment 3 weeks before he died was this triptych, The Last Judgment triptych. You can see the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and in San Francisco, and in Paris. And on his deathbed was doing Radiant Baby drawings on the back of Pop Shop stationery until he just became too frustrated and couldn't complete it. I think Kenny Sharp has the last of these drawings. So that, you know, that kind of, I talked to his doctor, and it was said to me that, you know, Keith used to come in the waiting rooms at doctors' offices during AIDS, if any people were around then, were always jammed. Like standing room only or walker room only, you know, all these people were mixed in. And he just said when Keith would show up, there would be this kind of energy, which he said was radiant, for lack of a better word. And he said it wasn't because he was a celebrity, it was just that he had this kind of contagious, upbeat sort of energy and approach to what was going on. I think it carried through.
Yeah, I read that he was, the one hesitancy about being labeled a person with AIDS was he was very aware of what, like the sort of gruesome fact of what it would do to the value of his work. And he, you know, of course, hated the fact that, you know, because of people knew he was going to die, they were going to, you know, increase the value of his work while he was making, which is horrible to think about, and also for someone like him who, although I am curious, what, you know, here's someone who dad drops him off in New York and he lives at the YMCA, and, you know, how did he really support himself, and then how did his life really change just from his success? Was there any real, you know, because Warhol, it certainly, you know, how he lived was very important to him,
Right.
obviously.
Yeah, it becomes, I mean, the idea behind this in some way, right, when he's in semiotics class at SVA, he writes a paper about, you know, how the art world works and how scarcity, how, you know, like the value has to do with scarcity, right? So you don't want to create too many works of art. The less that's on the market, the higher the value is. And obviously then he tries to figure out, he's always trying to figure out an end run around this in some way. He has these two tracks going on where he's
Well,
like,
because he's so prolific,
yeah, he's also,
and, you know, and, yeah.
works all the time, right? So,
And also so commercial, yet doesn't seem to be driven by wealth,
right.
which is sort of interesting, because you think about creating a shop, it's because I want to sell out my name, or I, you know, all of this stuff. It's
Right.
sort of a contrast, which.
I mean, then through the second half, like 4 years in the 1980s, when he really is making all this money, he's living with his second lover, Juan Rivera, in this 4th floor walkout next to the Waverly Theater on 6th Avenue, across from the basketball courts, because he likes to see the guys playing basketball with their shirts off. This is, and he stays there. And, you know, people would think like, what, you know, like, what's Keith Haring, you know, doing in this little 1-bedroom, like, rental in this crazy place? But he just wasn't paying attention. He was most of the time in his studio. Then at the end, gets this super apartment, which is, you know, his kind of planning. It's basically an apartment to die in, and an apartment that people will be able to come to, where he can show his work and all of that, which he then builds. But it's never that important. At the end, he does start spending his money. And,
Yeah.
you know, and it's fun. I mean, and he stays at the Ritz, as you know, months on end when he's in Paris, and he definitely spends money and gives away money and enjoys all of that. But when he dies, his estate is valued at that time at $25 million, you know, which is already kind of a leap from 10 years before. So it's just amazing. like in 2001, that scene where the astronaut goes through, all that time in some way and is dealing with these all the issues of gravity and stuff. It's that kind of flash, I think, in his career.
In a way, it seems obvious, like, why you chose to write a biography of Keith Haring, but I think it would be interesting just to hear you've written wonderful biographies of others, but why Keith, why now, how long did it take you by those?
6 or 7 years, depending how you count.
Yeah.
I think, well, for the longest time I wanted to write a novel about Keith Haring. I mean, longest time was from the early 90s. One thing that happened, hard to believe now, was that Haring and Basquiat kind of faded after their deaths in the 90s. I think there was a feeling like the party's over now, and they were part of a scene, but they weren't really part of art history. There were these other artists, Mary Boone Gallery, who were really important, and not these guys. And so, and I wanted to find a way to write about that time, and he was so much an emblem and a fulcrum for what was going on, because he was also partying, and he was part of the party and the creator of it. So I carried that idea around for a decade or 2 decades, and then when it came time to actually do it, maybe I thought about it too long, and then I realized I don't like novels about famous artists and creatives, and also the shift had happened, where I was feeling now, Keith Haring's actually history now, I mean, it's different, and you didn't necessarily, you couldn't count on, as I was saying earlier, people necessarily understanding what was happening at that time. Even young queer people I was talking to, that you could tell didn't really know what it was like to live downtown, where 50% of gay men under 30 were dying of AIDS at the time. So the telling of that seemed important, and the way to combine the narrative and information, because the information was startling in this case.
Yeah.
That was it. And and the feeling that what then Ann Temkin talked to me about 5 years later, which is that people are looking at the work differently now.
It also seems so relevant right now in the world that we're living in. Even more so the past few days somehow. Because I just read it and I'm living through these moments,
Right.
and feeling like he was such a messenger, and
I mean, I don't know what Keith Haring would be doing now, but he would certainly be a voice in this moment. Whether he was creating art that we recognize or anything, I think he would not be quiet at this moment. So how he would find his voice, interesting. And also the art world has changed. I mean, he's been kind of taken up by the second generation of artists, which you can't force. And people like Haas, Barry, Banksy, they're all kind of school of Haring. They all say that. Kaz went to Pop Shop, and he was a teenage skateboarder, and was inspired to become an artist of the kind that he is by that. And a lot of work, whether consciously or not, now that's happening in the art world has a lot of Haring sensibility to it. He's kind of working on any surface licensing, so that you can use your images in fashion and film and TV and does everything. Communication, collaboration, democratization, all that seems kind of natural to us. So, I actually think that Keith's work seems more understandable now than it did when it was coming out. And so he does seem, in that way, relevant.
Are you okay to take some questions?
Yeah, sure.
Alex, I knew Alex.
He's wearing a Haring t-shirt, right? There's a lot of Haring imagery coming in. I mean, when I don't know if anyone has a tattoo, and I like sign, there you go. It's always someone in line who has a tattoo. My family is voting with
Ladies and gentlemen.
So I'm curious, we're in Provincetown, there's sort of the famous A-house, piece of Haring's. Did he come here? Did he have any history here that you know?
Yeah, I mean, he was in Provincetown, but I can't, trying to think of a real
I tried to find out.
moment.
Because I was very curious. but-
Yeah, but I don't remember anything happening in that way, like, or any
Yeah.
permanent.
Warhol had more sort of history.
Yeah, a lot of, I mean, everyone did, right? I'm not thinking of.
Or was Fire Island a thing for him that we know of?
Not so much Fire Island. Why is this? But he was much more downtown East Village-y kind of guy. I mean, when he gets to New York, first, 78, and living with Frank Holiday, he's in this kind of golden age of promiscuity, West Village, coming out thing, and going to the International Stud, going to the trucks and the piers and having sex and going, like that. That doesn't even really then last. He kind of shifts, and he's much more, into these kind of art or situations, like the police and stuff like that. That was his work.
He wasn't really skating in New York.
Right.
Did he have a kind of conceptual idea of his art in the sense that, from a theoretical perspective, he was doing this? You talked a bit about the economic ideas that he had about scarcity, but was he reacting to something, or was he really just doing something more intuitive, influenced by the street art of his time?
No, I mean, interestingly, he was a conceptual artist, I think, in a way, and meaning that he had a plan. I mean, he always had a plan. And in terms of the art, one piece of it was that, like, then, changing the way that you would present your art, right? The means of distribution. And some of this, I think, he got from the Grateful Dead. They were giving out bootleg tapes, and they were giving out T-shirts and doing all this stuff, and it just came back to them. I mean, it created an even bigger audience for them. He uses that model, I think, of giving it away. It drove his dealer, Tony Shafrazi, crazy. The giving away and the pop shop and all these things. That was definitely part of it. And with that, art for everybody. And that was the big, you had to have one bumper sticker.
Yeah.
Keith Haring, it was art for everybody. And that's there from semiotics class. I mean, you can kind of trace it. And to show that he knew what he was doing, at the end of his life, then part of the answer to also why we're here talking about Keith Haring is that he does a will, 20-something-year-old guy, then sets up a will and sets up a foundation and sets up a very specific plan for the foundation, which is to protect the legacy of his work, but also to give away money to causes that he cared about, mainly about youth and AIDS treatment and care. And that foundation has now given away about $40 million since Keith died. So he set up this double track kind of system in his mind in his late 20s, and we're living it out. I mean, there's licensing, so you see these images everywhere. My kids, you go to their playground, there's people who are wearing kids are wearing Keith Haring hoodies. Across from my son's 4th grade classroom, there's this brown paper where all these kids have learned how to draw by using a Keith Haring model. I mean, so that's the next generation. But he kind of helped set that up. So he was always aware, but at the same time, then when he was actually producing the work, he would do it in this, I think he really felt it was flowing through him, and he didn't want to censor or edit it. So it was, you had both going on.
We usually try to like pigeonhole or trace an artist's development. Say like Pollock, you can go back to his teacher Benton at the School of Visual Arts and all that. But with Haring, yes, there's the cartoon stuff influence. Yes, there's the conceptual stuff, but nobody is doing his line. Nobody that I know,
Right.
nobody is doing just that. It's like appears. And then afterwards, you can say, well, if as artists go on and such, then there's a school of so-and-so.
Right.
But there can't be a school of Haring because all it would be is a copy of Haring.
Right.
So he's a moment in time, nothing before, nothing after. Yeah, the energy and all that kind of stuff and the
Right.
happenings. But where do you go with
Right.
a school of Haring? You can't. He's totally, his line is his.
Right.
Totally unique. You can't expand upon that, otherwise you're just a copycat.
Right.
Or is there a school of it that I don't, not?
No, I think there's a school that sort of some of the ideas. But, Haring would very much say that. I mean, his sense was that he's also inspired by Japanese calligraphy and this idea that your signature can't, it's personal. It can't be recreated. One reason he starts Pop Shop is that people are doing all these rip-offs of Haring, and there are fake Haring T-shirts everywhere. Someone at the time was in India, and saw a farmer in his, fields who had a Keith Haring T-shirt on. So there are a lot of, and in Japan, really a lot of fake herrings which he would collect. But what part of why he wanted a Pop Shop was that people would see the originals, because he said no one can copy anybody's line. I mean, it's their signature. So in that way, it was very much that. And also the thing his father, with 4-year-old Keith, was encouraging him to do always was do original cartoons. Meaning don't just copy Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, right? But make up your own. And there's a way of seeing all that kind of work as original cartoons. And I think that is part of also the endurance of it, is that he wasn't like just doing appropriation and imitation, which were interesting. But this was very like out of the psyche of Haring. So in that way, you're right. I think though some of the look of it, but more of the way that he was then licensing and crossing over with fashion and, as you were saying, all these art forms that people can kind of take on and make art that's popular, like Cause, and that part of him, but not the line. And that was the thing you could never take away. That there was something about this like preternatural talent that he had with drawing. You should watch, like on YouTube or anywhere, footage of Haring drawing and painting outside. Because then you see that he can't do it unless he has the whole thing in his mind before he starts. And then he goes up and he completes a whole piece, standing very close. But he can't. It's like you can't. If he kept doing that line, then this line wouldn't work. So somehow he knows he has the sense of it, and that can't be. That's the part that you can't recreate.
Any other questions?
Hi, you mentioned that the really spectacular apartment he built at the end, in which to die, and it just sounded incredible. What happened to it? First of all, did you get to see it, or was it published, and what happened to it?
Which one are you?
The very last residence. What was it? A 2-floor in Tribeca?
Oh, the studio. Yeah. So what happens? I've seen the work, and I know the building. It's now just something else entirely. But when the value of Haring, this is while he's still alive, the value of Haring's work starts going up foolishly. because people know that he's probably going to die. And so the studio becomes very busy. I mean, it was always, Keith always had a kind of party going on around him, and a boombox, and these kids smoking dope, and all this was happening while he was working. He was both in of it, he's of it, and he wasn't of it in some way. But at the end, it becomes it starts getting to be too much. So Tony Shafrazi says dealer sets up a studio for him in Tribeca. And this is like a secret studio. Not very many people saw it. And Keith put up 10, I mean, it's all perfect. Now there's money, and he has all these assistants, and he has brushes, and he has paints. And he puts up 10 blank canvases. And he does these 10 works, and some of them are great, and some of them are his best work. Unfinished painting is one of those, which is a comment on his death. So he really taps into something at the end in terms of these paintings. And that's all that he can do. I mean, they take the 10 paintings and then put up more, but he doesn't ever get to do anything else. But that's the way that he was working at the end. But it also shows how much, what a workaholic he was, how important the work was to him. And there's a kind of, which I've seen, I wrote a biography of the writer Flannery O'Connor, who then dies of lupus when she's 39. And she has this kind of magic thinking also, or spiritual thinking in her thing, that her writing is keeping her alive, basically. And I think he had that, right? That it was he was doing all this work, and the work was also keeping him alive. So that was also motivating a lot of this, and came close. I mean, he was never in the hospital. And he goes in, he can't work the last 3 weeks of his life. That's basically it, in terms of not showing up at the studio. So,
Amazing.
yeah.
I did compliment Brad on his book design. It's not only a great book, but it's beautiful to look at. They are for sale, and Brad is going to sign them. Not that I want to change topics, but last question. Do you have something, what's next? Have you started thinking about it, or is it just like a big sigh because you've lived in this world for 6 years?
Yeah, I think it's weirdly a big sigh. I mean, I'm kind of resting, which I never rested.
Because it's such a commitment, you're in their lives.
Yeah.
More poetry, maybe?
That's a good idea. Thank you. I keep asking people, I Anthony Worrell used to say, do you have any ideas for me? People gave him ideas, he got some. So thank you for that.
You're welcome, I'll take credit for it. Well, thank you, Brad.